21st Century Radio is sponsored by Hieronymus and Company. This is Talk Radio 680 WCBM. It's time now for award-winning 21st Century Radio. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Hieronymus.
In the lands of Middle-earth, legend tells of the Dark Lord Sauron and the ring that would give him the power to enslave the world. Lost for centuries, it has been sought by many, and has now found its way into the hands of the most unlikely person imaginable. Sauron needs only this ring to cover all the lands in darkness.
What must I do?
The ring must be destroyed.
The ring must be cast back into the fires of Mount Doom.
Everybody got somebody to lean on. Put your body next to mine and dream on.
Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. I'm Dr. Bob Hieronymus, or at least I'm pretending to be Dr. Bob Hieronymus tonight. You can... What's my line? No, that's not the right show. Remember, what's my line? Well, welcome back again to 21st Century Radio. We'll try to do it straight this time. And, of course, you know, the best show on the planet? Yep, it's Future Talk with J.R.R. And she's just won another award, the Golden Web Award. Congratulations to J.R.R. and look for her in the early, I think maybe January 3rd or January 6th issue of the Sun Papers on preparedness, one of a series of individuals that they interviewed. Of course, our executive producer and research assistant is Laura Ellen Kortner, and our engineer is Mike Anderson. I don't know his middle name, so we don't have his middle name, and it's not available on the list, so check it out for yourself. Well, you know, it's just 3 days. In 3 days, you'll find out why we nominated the New Line Cinema's Fellowship of the Ring for a series of Academy Awards, including an Oscar for its director, Peter Jackson, its special effects from Weta, and of course, especially Richard Taylor, who joined us a couple of weeks ago. No, it's just last week he joined us. It's especially appropriate when you consider that the scholar Tim Shippey refers to J.R.R. Tolkien as the author of the century. And Dr. Verlin Flieger, who joined us just a couple of weeks ago, elaborated on why he is the author of the 20th century. I didn't know he sold so many books. He's the world's champ. Well, to top it off, tonight's guest, Michael Stanton, believes that The Lord of the Rings is the finest work of heroic fantasy in the language. Holy heavens. Well, that's a lot that's a lot more important as far as I'm concerned than the best rock and roll band in the world, even though the best rock and roll bands in the world are going to get more press. You know, that's America today. Well, this hour's guest is Michael N. Stanton, author of Hobbits, Elves, and Wizards, exploring the wonders and worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, published by St. Martin's Press. Oh, St. Martin's Press has done a lot of great books in the past, and this is another one. Well, next hour, we're going to be joined by the legendary artists Tim and Greg Hildebrandt to review their Tolkien years, and a surprise phone call from Gimli. Gimli, John Rhys Davies, the actor who portrays Gimli the dwarf in New Line Cinema's Fellowship of the Ring. He'll be joining us beginning next hour. Now, who is this fellow that we're going to talk to tonight, Michael N. Stanton? Well, he has been teaching English literature at the University of Vermont since 1971, and during his tenure there, he inaugurated the standard course on science fiction and fantasy literature and has taught Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings every year. The standard course. Isn't that wonderful? Well, I wish I could have taken the standard course. Well, he has written on science fiction and fantasy literature as well as on Dickens and Melville. You know who I was referred to by Melville? No. It was Heinz Edelman. My producer will have to tell me as to what part in Melville I played in Heinz Edelman's mind. We'll figure that out someday. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio, or actually welcome to Michael N. Stanton. What does N stand for, Michael?
Stands for Neil, N-E-I-L-L.
Okay, N-E-I-L. There are two ways of spelling Neil, of course, and right?
It's with two L's.
Yeah, there's two L's, and there's an N-E-A-L, right?
Yes, there is.
Yeah, and there are 13 ways to spell Hieronymus that are all correct. Well, the stories of Middle-earth began from a love of language. Would you review how this manifested in Tolkien's creation of The Lord of the Rings?
Well, first of all, you know, I suppose, that he was, by profession, a linguist and a teacher of languages, Old English especially, and the languages of England in the Middle Ages. And he was a student of language and an inventor of language from his teenage years, so that his heart's desire and his professional interests were one and the same thing, which is a wonderful thing if that can happen. The words came first for Tolkien. One day, you've heard the story, I'm sure, one day he was correcting a very dull set of exam papers, as he tells the story, and in a fit of distraction, he wrote on the back of one of them, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." And that was the beginning of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, the stories that we have. So the word came first. After that came the question, well, what is a hobbit? Why do hobbits live in holes in the ground? What do they look like? That sort of thing. So the word was the beginning of the concept. For Tolkien, in the word was the beginning, indeed. So he had invented languages when he was a teenager. He worked on both the languages that he taught, real-world languages, and the languages that he invented. He said that he had invented Middle-earth, or created his Middle-earth realm as a place where the languages that he had made up couldn't be spoken. Right. And he also said, and I don't think he was serious about this, but he also said, or was quoted as saying, that if he could have done so, he would have written his book in Elvish rather than English. So you can see, I think, that his love of language is the primary motivation for his storytelling.
Well, I'm sorry I didn't take your course so many years ago, Michael. Really, I just had to intuit certain things. You know, when you learn it all by yourself, and you read it for your 40th time and listen to your 30th take on it, etc. Well, anyway, the language is really key, and I'm just, how many children sit around and develop languages?
Well, we all have our little private languages. Most of us don't go very far with them, of course.
Yeah, I'll say. I mean, he developed all kinds of grammar and everything else. The whole thing, the whole enchilada. He did the whole thing.
According to Ruth Noel, who wrote a book about this subject, there are 14 languages in Middle-earth. 14
languages, and he wrote them all.
Well, there are samples, I should probably say, of most of them. The only one that he developed so that you could, deduce the grammar and so forth was Elvish.
Now, in regards to the geography of Middle-earth, and many of us remember having those maps on our walls back there in the late 60s. Mine was long ago stolen by my friends. Mm-hmm. You know how friends would borrow things forever. Now, you note that it is a moral geography. Mm-hmm. What does that mean, moral geography?
Well, it means that the good comes from the west and flows into Middle-earth. The evil that we are contending with in the story is centered, at least, in the east. Eastern side, the eastern realm of Middle-earth. When people leave Middle-earth, elves leave Middle-earth, they go to the west. That's one way to think about it. That's sort of the horizontal dimension. In the other dimension, vertically, we think of Middle-earth, of course, as we think of our world, as between a heaven and a hell, or an ideal place and an evil place. And the middle Earth partakes of elements of both good and evil, which is why the struggle takes place. It's also the focal point of the struggle. That is to say, it's in the middle of the conflict, because the conflict between good and evil, the destruction of the ring, has to take place in that world. They can't take the ring and ship it elsewhere. The characters say that the battle has to be one here and now. It has to be fought by us. We can't avoid it, so that it is the place where we have to do what needs to be done. So it's middle in three senses, I guess.
Mm-hmm. In the sea west of Middle-earth was the great kingdom of men, the island of Numenor, or Westerness. Mm-hmm. And this was destroyed. Is there any link here to? Is this the same as Atlantis? And is this the great wave dream that Tolkien and his son both had?
An analog to Atlantis, I think. Certainly, his idea of a lost land in the middle of the sea is cognate with the Atlantis myth that we have. He elaborates it a great deal more, of course, because it's the focal point. It was the central arena of action in what he describes as the second age of Middle-earth. And the people who were saved when the destruction of Atlantis took place, or his Atlantis, his Numenor, were the people who migrated to Middle-earth itself and became the great leaders, the kings of Arnor and Gondor, his kingdoms in the north and the south of Middle-earth. And it's their descendants that we see in figures like Aragorn, the king-to-be, and other of the noblest, speaking in terms of character, not necessarily just blood, the noblest of human beings in Middle-earth today.
Were there many? Do you believe? I'm trying to remember whether or not Gandalf ever mentioned his existing in Numenor. Did he?
No, he did not.
He did not.
What he said was at one point that he remembers his youth in the West, and by that I think he means the far West, because he's not a human being, technically speaking.
Yes, that's right. And these are other things I wish I would have paid more attention to, all those appendices back there in 1969, because there's a lot of gold in those appendices. But you know how...
True. It is a mine.
You know how appendices are generally treated. You know, they're generally taken out and left somewhere as almost being non-functional in the outside world. Outside world. Now, Gandalf, then, is one of the... How do you pronounce this? M-A-I-A-R. Mayer?
I'd say Maiar.
Maiar.
I don't know.
Maiar.
I've never heard anybody else say it, so I don't know.
Yeah, he's acting for the Valor, or Valor. Now, let's find out who these entities are, so that we can then understand more about Gandalf, because I did not think of him not as a human. You know what I mean?
Well, as I understand Tolkien's creation myth, there is a one god whose name is given as Eru, E-R-U. He created a race of gods, or what Tolkien says, some people call them gods, superior beings at any rate, called the Valar, who came into the world, into the world, part of which is comprised of Middle-earth. They brought with them, or he created for them, servants or helpers. Tolkien says that they are of the same kind, but of lesser degree. And it is these beings, this class of beings, to which Gandalf belongs. He comes into our world in the third age of Middle-earth, our world, I think of it that way, of course. He comes into Middle-earth in the third age as a human figure in the guise of a human being, as a wizard. He came about the year 1000 of the third age. He's been in Middle-earth for quite some time when the story of the Lord of the Rings opens. But he's not a human being in the sense that we think of ordinary mortality. Mm-hmm. One of these helpers of the sub-gods, you might say. One way I think of him, and others might disagree with me, but I think of him as functionally analogous to an archangel. An archangel.
Okay, well, when we return, we're going to find out about the power of the ring, about which this film and series of films is all about, by New Line Cinema. Of course, they borrowed some of this material from J.R.R. Tolkien. And, of course, our guest is Michael Stanton. The book is Hobbits, Elves, and Wizards, exploring the wonders and worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. And it's published by St. Martin's Press, and it's available in any major bookstore. And you can visit us on 21stcenturyradio.com and order it from our website at amazon.com.
This is Timothy Good, author of Above Top Secret, Alien Contact, and Alien Base, and you're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronymus.
My dear people.
Oh, dear, I think Bill Bear's about to make a speech.
My dear Bagginses and Boffins. And my dear Tooks and Bradley Bucks and Grubbs and Chubbs. Yes. And Burrowses and Hornblowers. Bulgers, Brace Girdles, Good Bodies. Brockhouses.
Oh, yes.
And Proudfoots.
Proud feet.
Proudfoots. Also, my good Sackville Bagginses that I welcome back at last to Bag End.
Thank you.
Now, while you're filling up the corners, as we hobbits put it, I hope you'll permit me a few words. Today is my 111th birthday. I'm 11-1 today. And I hope you're all enjoying yourselves as much as I am.
That's a clip from Random House Audio's presentation of the BBC dramatization of Fellowship of the Ring. Just extraordinary. Robert Allen, the publisher of Random House Audio, will be joining us next hour. Our guest is Michael Stanton, Hobbits, Elves, and Wizards, exploring the wonders and worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. St. Martin's Press, available in any major bookstore. We like Borders, of course. Or visit 21stcenturyradio.com and order it online from Amazon. Get several copies, friends. We're getting to parts of the book. I've got so many questions that we'll never get a chance to ask, but we're getting to parts of the book that I just found wondrous. And, of course, I probably just embarrassed Michael and Stanton. Did I embarrass you, Neil?
No.
No, I... Okay,
nobody ever calls you that, but that's all right.
I know. Well, that's right. The only people that used to call me Richard, which is my middle name, you know why they used to call you Richard? Was you better hurry up and do this kind of stuff. Yeah, no. Richard, get it.
It's disobedient.
Now, the One Ring owes its allegiance to its maker, not its wearer, and in the folklore tradition, it might be called a trickster figure. What's that? What is a trickster figure in the folklore tradition?
Well, the one that comes to mind at once, of course, is in Nordic folklore, Scandinavian folklore, and that is Loki, who is always playing tricks on his fellow deities, both for the sense of showing his own cleverness and for the joy of pure malice, I suppose you could say. I think of the ring as a trickster figure because it is continually putting things over on people who are wearing it in order to get back to its maker or master, who is the evil Lord Sauron. It embarrasses Frodo in the inn at Bree. It betrays him, so to speak, at exactly the wrong time when it puts him in the greatest danger as at Weathertop. And it is always seeking to go back where it came from, and it will use anyone whom it can in order to further that goal. So that's how I see the ring as a trickster figure. It does seem to have a kind of will of its own, and it is certainly, as Sauron himself acknowledged, a great part of his power passed into that ring, and that's why he and it want to get reunited.
What are its powers and attributes?
Well, to betray whoever's wearing it to his own worst trait.
Boy,
for example, you've read the book. You know that Boromir tries to get the ring from Frodo because he imagines that it will make him a great leader of men, a great warrior in Middle Earth. This is his vanity, his pride, whatever you want to call it, along those lines, is what the ring is playing on. And if he should have by any chance gotten the ring, he would have turned into an evil tyrant rather than a great warrior. It would have perverted into the worst trait he could have, what he thinks of as his best. And that's why people who know themselves and know their own capabilities, such as Gandalf, refuse to have anything to do with the ring.
And Galadriel,
So
of course.
It converts what might be thought of in neutral terms as good or desirable qualities into evil ones.
Well, I'd love to take some time with Tom Bombadil. We're not, and the film doesn't have time for Tom Bombadil.
Right.
But what do you expect, Michael? I mean, the audio recorded books version of it, it's 22 and a half hours long. I've listened to it a number of times. And when you cut that down to 3 hours, you have no choice but to lose a few scenes. But we get a chance, we'll talk about him. But I'd like to get to the area that intrigued me most of all. This is a wonderful area of learning as far as I was concerned. I would have loved this back there about 30 years ago, like the origins of various people. Again, if I would have read the appendices, maybe I would have been smart, but I didn't do that. I wrote Rules and Regulations 702. But let's talk about the origins of say, the men of Rohan.
Okay, well, they are a subclass of men in general, of course.
Mm-hmm.
They are the horsemen who came out of a more northerly part of Middle-earth many hundreds of years ago and settled in the land of Rohan, which is a kind of pasture land. Since they're horsemen, that's very good. And they've been there as neighbors of the great kingdom of Gondor for many generations. They originated as a kind of culture long after the origination of the species, men or human beings, of course.
Now, they were later on. You discuss on page 121 other beings that are man-like or human from that standpoint. Men of Rohan are a member of that class, but they're not of the highest level in that class.
That's true. They were the highest level I mentioned. I think in that classification I have there on that page would be the men who had come into Middle Earth from Numenor, from the destroyed Numenor.
From Numenor, yes.
Other groups of the same species originated in Middle Earth, such as the men of Rohan.
Who else is in that human class in regards to the Lord of the Rings?
Men of Gondor, of course.
Gondor.
The wild men whom we meet on as the men of Rohan are riding to the aid of Gondor, the Woses, as they're called.
The Woses, I love that. That's wonderful.
It's a great name.
Yeah, they got the Woses out here.
And they are full-fledged human beings, of course, although they don't have the kind of cultural background or quote-unquote civilization that other groups have. And I think Tolkien makes it pretty clear to us that the Hobbits are human beings also, although they're obviously different in terms of certain characteristics of physiognomy.
Well, those who have studied Harry Potter, have you studied Harry Potter?
I've read the books. I can't say that I've studied them.
Well, the Hobbits are a little similar to Muggles.
How do you mean?
Well, they're focused on the here and the now. And,
I see what you mean. Yeah, but they're not despicable the way Muggles are.
Oh, no. No.
Muggles are, you don't want to run around with Muggles.
I know, yeah. Oh, I forgot about those Muggles. Oh, anyway.
They don't have any supernatural powers. That's certainly true.
So you have, as a matter of fact, you list 3 houses of men, 3 kindreds of men, all in the human class. And then let's get to then the orcs, because I'm sure that people, when they first read this material, think all these are generally the same, but they're not. There are differences. Sometimes the differences are subtle, and sometimes they're not so subtle. Like I always got the various armies confused. The dark forces of Sauron and the dark forces of Saruman. It used to confuse me a bit. But you helped straighten me out on that. Let's get to the orcs. What are their origins?
Well, they are, according to Tolkien, in the Silmarillion, which is a book whose material, not its publication date, but its material precedes The Lord of the Rings. They are elves. They were once elves, whom the Dark Lord Sauron or his master Morgoth twisted and perverted to their own uses many, many ages ago, many, many centuries ago. And the descendants of those twisted elves are the orcs that we see now. Treebeard the Ent says something to that effect, that orcs are counterfeits or parodies of elves, and I think that's what he means, that they were twisted into this grotesque form long, long ago, and that's what we see now. And what you're speaking of, the different groups of orcs, of course, are basically questions of breeding. They've been bred, like you might breed racehorses or dogs, to achieve certain characteristics. They originate in different areas of Middle-earth, thus they have different traits and different dialects and so forth and so on. You're right, it's confusing, and I don't think Tolkien always troubles himself to keep the various groups totally separately identifiable.
Well, I'm going to commit a blasphemy here. I wouldn't, I enjoyed his story so much that I wouldn't care if we ever finished thinking through some of those things, Michael.
Well, I agree with that.
I mean, how in the world? It's just amazing that he did so much. There's so much depth here that it's like many symphonies. It's like almost like a collection of all of Beethoven's 8 plus whatever symphonies that he completed all together in one. It's just almost too much to think any one person could do this much.
Well, I agree with that, and of course that's one of the things that makes the book so rich, is that there is so much in it, and so much is hinted at, and so much is alluded to, and there are these layers of history that are visible underneath the surface wherever you look in Middle-earth.
Yes, and it's a multi-layered. Multi-layered, I guess, is one way. That's not quite accurate, but similar. Now, the Ents. I've always found fascinating. We will not bump into in the New Line Cinema film no Ents.
Not yet. There would be in the second movie.
Yes, that's right. There's no Ents yet. And tell us about the Ents and their relationship to what we would consider trees.
They are tree herds. They're masters of trees. They keep track of trees. They help trees achieve their growth and fullness. They manage the trees that are going bad and have rot at the heart of them and that sort of thing. They were once, according to Treebeard the Ent, much more active in the life of Middle-earth centuries ago. See, when you talk about the origins of things, there's really two quite different but equally fascinating concepts that you could discuss. One is the origin, for example, of Ents in terms of the history of Middle-earth, how old they are and where they originally came from and that sort of thing. And also the origin of Ents in terms of their appearance in Tolkien's imagination to be put in the story, which is slightly different, because the Ents, as far as Tolkien's idea of them, came very, very late. Even as he was writing Book 3, let's say the first half of the book called The Two Towers.
How dare he do such a thing? Who does he think he is?
He was surprised himself.
Well, I mean, that's one of the great things about artistry and creative genius, that, there are certain times when you have to bend rules, regardless of whether you're being consistent or not, and that's the artist's choice. I'm glad he did. We got to take a break here. I'd like to spend a little bit more time on Ents, but we're not going to have time. But I'll tell you what I'd like to do is get to dwarves and Shelob before we go into another area, because these characters repeat themselves, and I think we need a better understanding. And we're depending on you, Michael.
I'll do my best.
We're depending on you to make sure that we get the inside stuff here on Hobbits, Elves, and Wizards, exploring the wonders and worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, Palgrave, or St. Martin's Press, an imprint thereof of St. Martin's Press, available in any major bookstore. Go to Borders, of course, or visit 21stcenturyradio.com and order it online from Amazon.
this is Robert Boval. I'm the author of The Orion Mystery and Message of the Sphinx. And you're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronymus as your host. May the quest go on.
I've merely begun to wonder about the ring.
You're being very mysterious. What are you afraid of?
I'm not certain. So I'll say no more. I may be able to tell you something when I come back.
Come back? Well, you're going away too?
Yes, and I must go at once.
But why? I thought you were staying on for at least a week.
I intended to, but I've had to change my mind.
Well, how long will you be gone?
It may be for some while, Frodo, but I'll come and see you again as soon as I can. Look out for me, especially at unlikely times.
Another clip from Random House Audio's presentation of the BBC dramatization of Fellowship of the Ring. That's Gandalf wondering about the ring. As a matter of fact, Robert Allen, publisher of Random House Audio, will join us for a few minutes next hour. Our guest, of course, is Michael N. Stanton. Hobbits, Elves, and Wizards is the book. We've been exploring wonders and worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, published by St. Martin's Press. Available in all major bookstores. Go to Borders ASAP. Order it from Amazon.com. And, geez, my heavens, time is just escaped. And we have not talked about dwarves, and we've got to talk about dwarves. It's absolutely necessary because Gimli is joining us next hour. He's going to be our first guest for a few minutes. And so we've got to talk about dwarves in relationship to the Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring. So let us know all about dwarves in 2 easy lessons, Dr. Michael N. Stanton. Professor Michael N. Stanton.
Mm-hmm. Well, lesson 1 is that you can sense as you read the story through a kind of hidden or muted enmity between the dwarves and the elves. And the reason for that lies in the deep history of Middle-earth. That's one of the things that's fascinating about the whole realm. There has been a quarrel between them for many ages because they were, as it were, their creation was sort of interpolated into the intended order of things. So they're regarded as upstarts, I suppose you could say. Mm-hmm. That's one thing you could learn about them. The second thing is that they have both suffered from and caused a great deal of hardship in Middle-earth because of the quality that we associate with dwarves in our own, this world of folklore, which is greed. And that's why the mines of Moria are such a dangerous place for the Fellowship of the Ring as they pass through, because the dwarves who returned there to mine the precious metal mithril have awakened a terrible beast that lay dormant in the bowels of the earth. And they are, of course, master craftsmen. That's 3 lessons, I guess.
That'll be on the quiz next week, friends.
Yeah, right.
Now, well, they are kind of like upstarts in regards, of course, to the elves, because the elves are immortal, right? Mm-hmm. And dwarves aren't immortal, and elves were created before dwarves, right?
They weren't supposed to be, but that's how it worked out. Yes.
Okay. Then, of course, what kind of dwarf was... And I shouldn't say dwarf with an F, because I remember Dr. Verlin Flieger in her book pointing out that Tolkien preferred the V-E, not the F.
Exactly. He that's how he distinguished
it's not Snow White
from our dwarfs.
Yeah, it's not our Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs type thing here. But Gimli was a very unusual dwarf, wasn't he?
Well, he became so. I mean, we recognize him as such by the time the story has progressed a ways. For one thing, he swears fealty, swears great loyalty to an elf.
Yes.
2 elves, actually. Mm-hmm. One, he swears fealty to Galadriel, the mistress of Lothlorien, and he swears friendship with his male companion, Legolas, or Legolas, if you like, the dwarf who's a member of the Fellowship itself. And that makes him extremely uncommon among the usual run of dwarves, if you can say something like that.
Yeah. If we're allowed to, and And I don't know, with all the limitations these days from this part of the family or that part of the family, whether we'd be allowed to say too many things along those lines. Now, of course, then here's a being I've wanted to know a great deal about, and I'm glad you reminded me to go to the appendices and straighten me out on this. Shelob and her relation with Sauron. Shelob is a very large spider.
Yes.
What's her origin?
She originated from the first stage of Middle Earth. Her eventual ancestry was back then. She is described in Tolkien's words as the last child of Ungoliant, which is a spider creature of the first age, the last child of Ungoliant to trouble the unhappy Earth. And she's, as you know, situated in that mountain pass which guards one of the main entrances to Sauron's land of Mordor. Her relationship to Sauron is one of mutual self-interest, I guess you could say. He knows she's there. She's very useful to him as guarding that entrance against spies and little hobbit-like creatures who might come creeping in. In return, he feeds her. He sends her prisoners for whom he has no more use, and she feeds on them. And as Tolkien says, report is brought back to Sauron of the sport she makes with them. So they have this mutual interest. Neither of them, there's no question of loyalty or anything like that, you understand. Each is working for his/her own advantage, but it's useful for them to work together. There were spiders in The Hobbit, if you remember, and I think these are some of her descendants.
Yeah, while we're in the area of evil, you point out that the basic weakness of evil is that evil lacks imagination. And, of course, that bodes very well for Gandalf and Frodo in several ways. Tell us a little bit more about this situation. What are the limitations when you lack imagination?
Well, let me say this to begin with. The reason they lack imagination, these forces of evil, and you see this in Milton's Satan, for example, as well as anywhere else, is that they are totally absorbed in themselves. One of the great manifestations of evil in Tolkien's world is total egotism. Thus, one can't get outside of oneself. One cannot imagine what someone else might do. The way that works in the book, practically, is that Sauron has made this ring many centuries ago. It is a great and powerful ring. He naturally wants to get it back. That's what this whole struggle is about. He would, if he had the ring, use it. He would augment his power. He would use it to dominate peoples and who are less powerful militarily or whatever than himself. That's the only thing he can imagine to do with it. He cannot imagine, as Gandalf says a couple of times, that if we, that is to say the forces of good, had the ring, he cannot imagine that we would not use it. Far less can he imagine that we would actually seek to destroy it. So that if Gandalf and his helpers do those things, they will put Sauron out of his reckoning, because he won't be thinking that they could possibly want to, A, not use the ring, and B, actually destroy the ring. So if they take steps in those directions, they can outwit Sauron. That's what I mean by the weakness of the lack of imagination.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think it's evident even in our culture today. Dare I say such a thing? As we move through the trilogy of The Lord of the Rings, and of course you note, I believe you note in your book, that you really can't call this a trilogy, and that perhaps Tolkien didn't think of it in those terms.
No, he didn't.
What should we really call it then?
A long novel.
A long?
No, sorry, you can't even call it a novel. Call it a long story, which, for the convenience of publishing, is divided into three parts. This is the way Dickens used to publish his novel in the 19th century. It was a very common publishing practice to have a 3-volume work.
Well, the third volume, so to speak, if we're allowed to say such a thing, is the Return of the King. And, of course, Aragon is perhaps he's introduced as Strider and Long Leg or something like that.
Longshank.
Thank you. Aragorn. He is supposedly going to. Well, he becomes a king. And what is in Aragorn's background that prepares him for for being able to claim his right to be king, since there hasn't been a king for quite a while?
Right. Well, one basic thing, is that he is of the right lineage. His ancestors were kings long ago. They were men from Numenor. But that's not the most important thing, because that would imply that his father could have been king, or his grandfather, or something like that. He has to earn his kingship. He has to prove his right to the throne of Gondor. One way he does that, of course, is by the accomplishments that he undertakes. I should say the accomplishments he does, the tasks he undertakes in the course of the War of the Rings. His quality of leadership, his aura of authority. He undergoes a series of tests, I think you might say, that qualify him to take the throne when the time comes. He is ratified in his right to take the throne by a series of tokens that are either accompany him or are presented to him. One would be the sword that he wears. Another would be the white tree that he and Gandalf find in the wilds, in the snows, in the hills above the city of Minas Tirith and Gondor. All these things are tokens of his right to be king. And plus, he has the agreement of various peoples, the men of Rohan, the Hobbits, those elves which are left in Middle-earth. All of these people agree that he has earned the right to be king, and that the throne should now be reoccupied.
Well, that seems to be the destiny of the human race, then, to take over in the fourth cycle.
That's the idea. This is the age of men, human beings.
And we learn from all the bad guys, Sauron, that we don't want to build too many factories and mess things up. We learned that we never want to pollute the ocean, so we wouldn't do that again. Right. So, and by the way, just as an aside here, Joseph Campbell, did he ever mention the work of Lord of the Rings or J.R.R. Tolkien in any of his mythology work? I don't recall.
Not that I know of, which doesn't mean he didn't know it, of course.
Well, I'm putting him under arrest. He can't possibly talk about mythology and not talk about Tolkien.
Well, if you can find him, do it.
All right, now. That's the advantage, you see, Michael. I couldn't find him. I did my best. Now, you believe that The Lord of the Rings is the finest work of heroic fantasy in the language.
Yes.
That's an astounding thing to say. Why do you say this?
Well, first of all, heroic fantasy is itself a reasonably narrow genre. But within that narrow genre, I think that The Lord of the Rings is the finest for these reasons. It has the greatest scope, and you must have noticed perhaps the greatest length of such books.
Yeah.
Although Tolkien said it was too short, and I agree with him.
I agree with that, yeah.
It has the greatest depth in the sense that we were talking about a couple of minutes ago, the layering of history, the richness of the world that he creates through artifacts, through allusions, through references which are perfectly appropriate contextually, but they imply a story that is not told. The work is the finest work of heroic fantasy because it not only incorporates the traditional elements of heroic epic, you think of Beowulf, you think of the Arthurian material, but it also unexpectedly focuses on people like Frodo.
Right.
Who are not cut out to be heroes, but as we have indeed seen in recent months, when ordinary people are called upon to do extraordinary things, they have that capability, and that's what Frodo has.
Thank you for joining us, Michael. I really learned a great deal from your work, and I appreciated many different things that you said this evening. And, of course, Peter Jackson wanted detailed, as a matter of fact, as much detail in the film to make it real, and that's exactly what Tolkien did in his own research and putting this together. The book Hobbits, Elves, and Wizards St. Martin's Press, get a couple of copies. Next hour, of course, we're going to be joined by actor John Rhys Davies, who plays Gimli in the New Line Cinema Lord of the Rings, opening December 19th.